New York City has seen thousands of murders, countless gang wars, and crime bosses rising and falling like empires built on blood. But there was one crime boss who didn't just kill his enemies, he turned them into warnings. When the American Mafia tried to take control of Harlem, they expected violence, they expected gunfights, they expected a street war. What they got instead terrified the entire underworld. Because one man decided revenge should never be hidden. He decided revenge should stand in public, where everyone could see it. This is the dark story of the crime boss who forced the mafia to surrender without starting a war. Harlem, winter of 1958, carried a rhythm that never truly slept. Neon lights hummed over crowded sidewalks, jazz spilled out of basement clubs and drifted into alleyways like secrets looking for listeners. Money moved quietly through card tables, backroom bets, and whispered negotiations that shaped entire neighborhoods without a single newspaper headline. And in the middle of it all stood one name people spoke with careful respect: Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson. Before we dive deeper into this story, if you enjoy powerful crime history through cinematic storytelling, make sure you subscribe to Canon Off Darkness. This channel is built for viewers who love gripping true crime legends, hidden power struggles, and the untold stories history tried to forget. On the night everything changed, snow rested in thin layers along Lenox Avenue, turning streetlights into glowing halos. Inside the Lenox Social Club, the air felt warm, thick with cigar smoke and the quiet confidence of men who believed they controlled their world. A record spun softly in the corner, playing slow jazz that matched the careful shuffle of cards sliding across green felt tables. Bumpy Johnson moved through the club like a man checking the heartbeat of his territory. He wasn't loud, he didn't need to be. His reputation traveled faster than his footsteps. Every dealer, every bartender, every lookout understood that Harlem wasn't just where he worked, it was what he protected. Across the room, glasses clinked, dice rolled, and thousands of dollars changed hands with the calm efficiency of a business meeting. Harlem had built its own economy, its own structure, and its own rules. For years, outside crime families respected those boundaries. Crossing them wasn't just risky, it was considered reckless. That unspoken agreement shattered at exactly 11:47 p.m. The front door opened, and 16 men stepped inside. They didn't rush, they didn't shout. Their silence carried more authority than violence ever could. Their suits looked freshly tailored, their polished shoes reflected the dim club lights. They spread through the room with unsettling coordination, like players who had rehearsed every movement before walking through the door. Patrons felt it immediately. Conversations died mid-sentence. Cards stopped sliding across tables. Dealers paused without looking up, sensing something far bigger than a simple robbery unfolding. 4 men drifted toward the exits, casually blocking them without drawing attention. 3 moved straight toward the cash counter. The others positioned themselves across the gaming floor, creating an invisible cage around everyone inside. Bumpy noticed everything.
This is business now. Monthly business. Around them, cash was already being gathered. Dealers handed over stacks without resistance. Customers were quietly escorted out, their confusion mixing with fear as they stepped back into the frozen Harlem streets. The entire operation lasted less than 12 minutes. 16 men walked in, 16 men walked out, and they left behind an empty bag and a warning that Harlem no longer belonged to itself. As the door closed, tension exploded inside the club. Trusted lieutenants demanded immediate retaliation. Guns were checked, tempers burned, pride demanded blood. But Bumpy raised his hand and stopped everything. He understood something his men didn't yet realize. This wasn't about money. This was about ownership. And while everyone around him believed the invasion had just ended, Bumpy Johnson had already begun planning something far more calculated. Something designed not just to punish his enemies, but to rewrite how power itself would be remembered in New York City. Because while those 16 men believed they had delivered a threat, they had actually volunteered to become part of a legend that would haunt organized crime for decades. And the first move in Bumpy's quiet retaliation would begin with a single notebook and a list of names no one expected him to already have. But what Bumpy planned to do with those names would turn a simple extortion attempt into one of the most chilling psychological power plays in underworld history. The club slowly refilled with noise, but the energy had changed. Jazz still floated through the air, cards still touched the tables, and drinks still poured into waiting glasses. Yet beneath the surface, Harlem felt like it was holding its breath. People whispered instead of talked. Dealers glanced toward the door more often than usual. Everyone understood something dangerous had just unfolded, but nobody knew how it would end. Bumpy Johnson sat in his private office above the club, staring at the leather satchel left behind. The empty bag rested on his desk like an insult that refused to fade. Snow drifted past the frosted window behind him, covering Harlem's streets in quiet white layers that made the neighborhood appear calm. But calm in Harlem never meant safe. Calm meant something was building. Illinois Gordon paced across the room like a storm trapped inside a man. His revolver clicked repeatedly as he spun the chamber open and closed, the metallic sound echoing against the walls. We should have dropped him right there. 16 bodies on the floor, problem solved before midnight. Bumpy didn't respond immediately. He poured himself a glass of bourbon and watched the liquid settle before taking a slow sip. 16 bodies create 16 funerals. 16 funerals bring police. Police bring newspapers. Newspapers invite enemies we're not ready to fight. Gordon stopped pacing. His frustration burned through his expression. So we just let them walk in here and disrespect Harlem? Bumpy leaned back in his chair, folding his hands together as if calculating numbers only he could see. There's a difference between reacting fast and reacting right. The room fell silent except for the distant bass line of jazz drifting through the floorboards. Marcus, the club bartender, knocked lightly before stepping inside. He carried a worn composition notebook clutched tightly under his arm. Unlike Gordon, Marcus looked calm, focused, and almost surgical in his movements. You asked me to remember everything, Marcus said, placing the notebook carefully on the desk.
Bumpy nodded once. Marcus opened the pages, revealing rows of neat handwriting filled with detailed observations. The one who talked had a scar under his left ear, Marcus began. Gold ring on his right hand. Initials looked like PC or maybe PG. Strong Italian accent, smelled like garlic and cologne. Bumpy listened without blinking. Marcus flipped another page. 3 men worked the cash counter like they'd done it together before. One kept touching his left side, probably checking a shoulder holster. One of the door guards was called Frankie. Another one got called Bells by the others. Gordon slowly lowered his revolver. You got names already? He asked, surprised. I got habits, too, Marcus replied. I can find where they eat, where they sleep, where they get careless. Bumpy reached forward and slid the notebook toward himself. He studied every line carefully, as if each description carried more weight than money ever could. You did good, Bumpy said quietly. Marcus nodded once and left the room, closing the door behind him. Gordon stared at Bumpy, confusion replacing his anger. You're not scared, are you? Gordon asked. Bumpy closed the notebook and placed it beside the empty satchel. "Fear makes men rush," he said. "I don't rush." Outside, Harlem continued moving like nothing had happened. Runners delivered betting slips, musicians tuned instruments, street vendors argued over prices. But beneath that routine, rumors were already spreading through the neighborhood like wildfire carried by winter wind. People whispered that Harlem had just been conquered. People whispered that Bumpy Johnson had been humiliated in his own house. And those whispers reached Brooklyn by morning. Joseph Bonanno sat inside his elegant brownstone study, reading reports from his captains. He sipped espresso while reviewing details of the Lenox Social Club raid. 16 men deployed, full compliance, 0 resistance. Bonanno smiled faintly. "He understands arithmetic," he said calmly. "He knows he can't fight us." Across the city, Bumpy Johnson sharpened a pencil and opened a fresh notebook page. He began writing names, addresses, daily routines, weak points, patterns invisible to anyone who wasn't patient enough to hunt slowly. Gordon watched him write for several minutes before asking the question everyone in Harlem wanted an answer. "What exactly are you planning to do with those 16 men?" Bumpy didn't look up. "Killing them would be easy," he said softly. "Easy gets forgotten." The pencil scratched steadily across paper as snow continued falling outside, covering Harlem in peaceful silence that hid something far darker growing beneath it. "I'm going to do something they never prepared for," Bumpy continued. Gordon swallowed hard. What could be worse than death? Finally, Bumpy lifted his eyes, and for the first time that night, something cold flickered behind them. "I'm going to make them wish death came first." Because while Bonanno believed Harlem had surrendered, Bumpy Johnson had already begun building a response so disturbing, so unforgettable, it would force every crime family in New York to reconsider stepping foot into his territory again. And the first man on Bumpy's list was about to disappear during a simple morning routine without anyone realizing they were witnessing the opening move of a nightmare that would soon spread across the entire city. Morning arrived in Brooklyn with the normal rhythm of city life, pretending danger didn't exist. Bakeries opened before sunrise, delivery trucks rattled down narrow streets, coffee steamed inside crowded corner shops where men read newspapers and complained about the cold. Everything looked ordinary. Everything sounded ordinary. And that was exactly why nobody noticed the moment the nightmare truly began. Paulie Castellano stepped out of his black Cadillac at 7:32 a.m. sharp, parking in the same space he used every Thursday morning. He straightened his coat, adjusted his hat, and walked toward Vittorio's bakery with the relaxed confidence of a man who believed routine made him safe. Snow crunched under his polished shoes as he pushed open the glass door. The bell above it chimed softly, announcing his arrival like it always did. Inside, the smell of fresh cannoli and roasted espresso beans wrapped around him like a familiar blanket. The owner nodded without asking questions. Paulie never changed his order. 1 coffee, 2 cannoli, 1 folded newspaper tucked under his arm before heading back to his car. It had been his ritual for years, and rituals created comfort. Rituals created predictability. Rituals created weakness. Outside, a panel truck idled quietly across the street. Nobody paid attention to it. Trucks parked everywhere in Brooklyn. Workers unloaded goods every morning. Nothing about it looked suspicious. 2 men stood near the sidewalk pretending to argue about directions, their voices blending naturally into the street noise. Paulie stepped back outside with his paper bag in hand. He unfolded his newspaper, scanning headlines while walking toward his Cadillac.
He never saw the men approaching from opposite directions. He never heard the truck door slide open behind him. The attack lasted less than 15 seconds. A cloth soaked in chemicals pressed tightly over his nose and mouth. Strong arms locked around his shoulders. His newspaper fell into the snow, pages scattering like startled birds. The bag of cannoli dropped beside it, powdered sugar mixing with dirty slush. By the time Polly's legs stopped struggling, the truck door slammed shut, and the vehicle rolled calmly into morning traffic. The Cadillac remained parked, the engine remained warm, the coffee inside the paper cup slowly cooled, while pedestrians walked past without noticing anything unusual. 3 miles away, Polly Castellano began waking up inside darkness. The warehouse smelled like wet cement and machine oil. Faint light filtered through blacked-out windows, revealing rows of wooden forms lined against the walls. Polly tried to move, but thick ropes cut into his wrists and ankles. Panic shot through his chest as memory slammed back into him like a speeding train. He tried to scream, but a gag muffled the sound into a desperate, broken noise. Across the room, boots echoed slowly against the concrete floor. Bumpy Johnson stepped into the dim light, his coat still dusted with snow. He studied Polly with calm curiosity, like a teacher observing a student who had failed an important test. Several of Bumpy's trusted men worked silently nearby, mixing bags of dry concrete with water inside large metal barrels. The grinding sound of shovels scraping against steel filled the warehouse with a rhythm that felt disturbingly methodical. Polly shook his head violently, trying to plead through the gag. His eyes begged for negotiation, for money offers, for anything that might stop what he could feel building around him. Bumpy moved closer, kneeling slightly so Polly could see his face clearly. "You walked into my house. You took my money. You threatened my people. You believed Harlem belonged to someone else." Polly's breathing turned frantic, chest rising and falling like it might collapse.
"This isn't revenge," Bumpy continued calmly. "Revenge fades. Revenge gets forgotten. I'm building something permanent." Behind him, men lifted wooden boards, tightening them into cylindrical frames positioned upright on the warehouse floor. The sound of hammering echoed like distant gunshots, each strike sealing Polly's growing terror. Polly's muffled screams grew louder as workers positioned him inside one of the wooden forms, securing him upright so he couldn't move. His shoulders shook violently as cold air rushed across his sweat-covered skin. He tried kicking, twisting, begging, but the restraints held firm. Bumpy stepped back, observing everything with quiet precision. "Your boss thought 16 men could scare Harlem. He thought numbers meant power." Buckets of wet concrete began sliding toward the wooden frame. Now he's about to learn something different. The first wave of cold gray mixture poured slowly around Polly's boots, thick and heavy like rising stone. His entire body convulsed as the freezing weight pressed against his ankles. The gag swallowed his screams as workers carefully adjusted the mixture, ensuring it settled perfectly around his legs. Polly's eyes locked onto Bumpy, desperate, pleading, terrified beyond language. Bumpy didn't blink, because Polly Castellano wasn't just disappearing. He was becoming the first piece of a message so horrifying, so unforgettable, it would force every crime boss in New York to question whether crossing Harlem was worth the price. And as the concrete climbed slowly toward Polly's knees, another team across the city was already preparing to collect the second name on Bumpy Johnson's list, a man who believed subway crowds made him impossible to catch.
New York City rush hour swallowed people whole every evening. Subways roared through underground tunnels packed with exhausted workers, street hustlers, musicians, and strangers pressed shoulder to shoulder. Noise filled every corner, train brakes screeching, vendors shouting, footsteps echoing across tiled platforms. In a city that crowded, disappearing felt impossible. Being surrounded by hundreds of witnesses felt like protection. Frankie Bones Caruso believed that. Tuesday night, Mulberry Street subway station buzzed with commuters rushing home from long shifts. The air smelled like metal rails, damp concrete, and cigarette smoke sneaking in from street level. Frankie stood near the edge of the platform, adjusting his expensive wool coat while checking the gold watch resting on his wrist. He glanced around casually, scanning faces without really seeing anyone. Frankie trusted routines. Every Tuesday and Friday, he visited the same apartment, the same woman, the same late-night dinner waiting upstairs. Predictable habits made him comfortable. Predictable habits also made him easy to follow. Across the platform, two men leaned against a pillar, pretending to argue about baseball scores. A third man flipped through a newspaper beside a vending machine. Another stood near the stairway exit, blending into the crowd like just another tired commuter. None of them looked connected, none of them spoke to each other, but each one tracked Frankie's movement with silent precision. The train roared into the station, wind blasting newspapers and coats into sudden motion. Doors slammed open, passengers flooded out, new passengers pushed forward. The platform transformed into chaos, exactly the kind of chaos Frankie believed protected him. He stepped toward the open subway door. That was when everything collapsed around him.
One man bumped into Frankie's shoulder from behind, spilling coins across the platform. Frankie turned instinctively, distracted by the sudden noise. Another man grabbed his arm as if steadying him from falling. A third figure pressed tightly into his side, forcing him toward the stairwell entrance instead of the train. The crowd swallowed the movement completely. A sharp sting struck Frankie's neck, hidden beneath the chaos of rushing bodies and screeching brakes. His muscles locked instantly. His breath caught halfway through a curse that never finished leaving his mouth. The newspaper reader folded his pages calmly while guiding Frankie's frozen body toward the stairs, like helping a sick friend find fresh air. Within seconds, Frankie Bones disappeared into the endless flow of commuters. The subway doors closed, the train departed, and nobody remembered seeing him again. Frankie regained consciousness inside darkness thick enough to swallow sound. His head throbbed violently as he tried to move, only to feel rough ropes tightening against his wrists. Panic exploded through his chest. He forced his eyes open, struggling to focus as dim yellow light revealed rows of wooden frames standing like unfinished statues around him. The smell hit him first. Wet concrete, chemical dust, cold industrial air that clung to his lungs with every breath. Frankie's pulse spiked when he saw Paulie Castellano standing upright across the warehouse, trapped inside a hardened gray cylinder. Only Paulie's face remained visible, frozen in terror that had never been allowed to escape. Frankie thrashed violently, muffled screams bursting behind the gag stuffed into his mouth. His chair scraped against the warehouse floor as he tried to break free, terror replacing every ounce of confidence he had ever carried. Boots echoed again through the warehouse. Bumpy Johnson stepped into view, his coat hanging neatly over his shoulders, his expression completely unreadable. Behind him, workers prepared another wooden mold, measuring every board carefully, tightening every nail with mechanical patience. Frankie shook his head violently, tears forming as he recognized the growing horror around him. "You came into Harlem believing numbers made you powerful," Bumpy said calmly. "You thought being part of 16 meant you couldn't be touched." Frankie's breathing turned frantic, chest jerking against the restraints. "You thought crowds would protect you. Crowds don't protect men who follow predictable paths." Workers dragged Frankie toward the empty wooden frame waiting near the center of the room. His heels scraped uselessly across the floor. His muffled screams echoed against the steel walls while concrete mixers roared louder behind him, drowning out any sound of mercy he tried to beg for. Frankie's eyes locked onto Polly again, watching dried concrete crust around the edges of the first monument, like a warning carved into stone. Bumpy watched silently as Frankie was secured upright inside the second mold. "Your boss thought this was business. This is education." The first bucket of cold gray concrete poured around Frankie's boots, creeping upward with unstoppable weight. His entire body shook violently as freezing mixture pressed against his skin, trapping him inch by inch. Across New York City, newspapers still ran ordinary headlines. Street vendors still shouted for customers. Crime bosses still believed the missing soldiers were temporary problems waiting to be solved. But inside that sealed warehouse, Bumpy Johnson had already collected 2 of 16. And somewhere across Brooklyn, another man named Anthony Bells was finishing his final drink behind a bar, completely unaware that he had just minutes left before becoming the third name erased from Bonanno's operation and the next monument preparing to stand where the entire city would be forced to see it. Nightfall settled over Brooklyn with the familiar glow of neon signs flickering to life along crowded streets. The Bamboo Lounge pulsed with laughter, clinking glasses, and the low hum of jazz drifting through cigarette smoke that hovered beneath the ceiling like a lazy storm cloud. For regular customers, it felt like just another ordinary evening. For Anthony Bells Marino, it felt like routine, safe, predictable, and completely under control. Bells stood behind the polished wooden bar, sliding drinks toward waiting hands with smooth confidence. He moved with practiced rhythm, barely looking down as he poured whiskey, wiped glasses, and joked with customers who trusted him to keep their nights running smoothly. Bells liked control. He liked knowing his environment. He liked believing nothing dangerous could reach him inside his own workplace. Above the bar, a small clock ticked toward closing time. Midnight approached, and the crowd began thinning out as patrons staggered toward exits or finished their final drinks. Bells counted the cash register carefully, stacking bills into neat rows while humming along to the slow jazz record spinning behind him. Outside, the street looked calm. Snow had melted into wet slush, reflecting streetlights across puddles like broken mirrors. A delivery truck sat parked near the alley entrance beside the lounge. Nothing unusual, nothing threatening. Brooklyn streets always carried parked trucks, especially near bars receiving late shipments. Inside, Bells finished wiping the counter and flipped the hanging sign from open to closed. Chairs scraped across the floor as the last customers stepped into the night, pulling coats tight against the freezing air. The lounge fell silent, except for the crackling record nearing its final note. Bells locked the front door, turned off half the lights, and grabbed his jacket from the hook near the kitchen entrance. He walked toward the back alley exit, lighting a cigarette as he pushed the metal door open. Cold air rushed inside, biting his face instantly. He stepped into the narrow alley, exhaling smoke that curled into the freezing darkness. He never heard the footsteps behind him. Strong hands grabbed his arms before he could turn around. The cigarette dropped into the slush, its orange glow fading instantly.
Bells tried shouting, but a heavy glove slammed across his mouth, forcing silence into panic. His body slammed against the brick wall as two figures pinned him in place, while another opened the delivery truck door waiting nearby. The entire alley swallowed the struggle within seconds. The metal door to the bamboo lounge swung gently in the wind, creaking quietly as if nothing had happened. Anthony Bells woke up coughing violently, his throat raw from chemicals burning inside his lungs. His head throbbed as blurred shapes slowly sharpened into terrifying clarity. Wooden frames surrounded him, the smell of concrete dust filled every breath, and directly across the warehouse floor stood two gray cylinders containing human shapes frozen into silent horror. Bells froze. Even through dim lighting, he recognized Frankie Bones's face staring outward from hardened concrete. Beside him, Paulie Castellano's expression had twisted into permanent fear, eyes wide and lifeless beneath the gray prison swallowing their bodies. Bell's entire body trembled as he fought against the ropes cutting into his wrists. Panic surged through his veins as realization crashed into him like a collapsing building. Boots echoed again. Bumpy Johnson stepped forward, his presence calm, controlled, and terrifyingly patient. Workers behind him shoveled dry cement into mixing barrels, their movements steady and methodical, like factory employees assembling parts on a production line. Bumpy settled lower, his voice thin and empty. You served drinks while my money was carried out of Harlem. You watched it happen. You believed you would walk away untouched.
Bells shook his head violently, tears streaming down his face as muffled screams burst through the gag in his mouth. This isn't punishment, Bumpy continued. This is memory. Workers dragged Bells toward the third empty wooden mold positioned beneath a hanging warehouse light. He kicked, twisted, begged, but his resistance meant nothing against practiced hands that secured him upright inside the frame. The concrete mixers roared louder as water and powder combined into thick gray slurry. The sound filled the warehouse with a relentless grinding rhythm that felt like time itself closing in. Bumpy watched silently as the first bucket of freezing concrete poured around Bell's boots, spreading slowly across his feet like rising stone swallowing flesh. Bell's entire body convulsed, terror shaking every muscle as cold weight trapped him inch by inch. Outside, New York City continued its endless motion. Taxi horns blared, late-night diners filled with laughter, crime bosses discussed business deals under chandelier lighting, completely unaware their organization was unraveling one soldier at a time. Inside the warehouse, 3 names were already erased from Bonanno's operation. 13 remained. And somewhere across the Bronx, a paranoid captain named Salvatore Grimaldi was tightening his security, doubling his bodyguards, and refusing to step outside alone, completely unaware that his desperate caution was about to force Bumpy Johnson into planning his most dangerous capture yet. Fear had begun spreading through Bonanno's organization, but it moved quietly, hidden behind forced confidence and controlled rumors. Men whispered about soldiers who missed meetings. They whispered about phones that rang endlessly without answers. They whispered about empty apartments where dinner plates still sat on tables, untouched and cold. Nobody said the word kidnapping out loud. Nobody dared imagine something worse. Salvatore Grimaldi refused to become one of those whispers. Grimaldi wasn't just another soldier. He was a captain. He was careful. He was paranoid. And he had survived years in organized crime by trusting nobody except the 2 armed bodyguards who followed him everywhere. He changed driving routes daily. He
He avoided public routines. He checked every restaurant entrance before stepping inside. Fear made him cautious, and caution made him confident he couldn't be caught. That confidence made him predictable in ways he couldn't see. The wedding took place on a quiet Saturday afternoon inside a decorated Bronx church glowing with stained glass light. White ribbons wrapped around pews. Families filled rows with laughter, music, and celebration that temporarily pushed crime and business out of their minds. Grimaldi stood proudly near the altar, watching his daughter prepare to walk down the aisle. His tailored suit fit perfectly. His polished shoes reflected the marble floor beneath him. For the first time in weeks, his expression softened. 2 bodyguards stood nearby, scanning every guest entering the church. Their eyes tracked movements constantly, searching for threats hidden among smiling relatives and camera flashes. They believed they controlled the environment. They believed celebrations created safety. They didn't understand that celebrations created distractions. The ceremony ended with applause and music echoing through the church. Guests poured into the reception hall attached to the building, where tables overflowed with food, champagne glasses, and dancing relatives celebrating a new marriage. Grimaldi shook hands, accepted congratulations, and laughed louder than usual, temporarily forgetting the tension pressing against his life. Hours passed.
Music grew louder. Drinks flowed faster. The reception transformed into joyful chaos, the kind of moment where guards relaxed just enough to miss tiny details that mattered. Grimaldi stepped outside around sunset, slipping through the side church exit with a cigar in his hand. He needed air. He needed silence. He needed one moment away from music and crowded congratulations. The parking lot looked peaceful beneath fading daylight. Snow lined the edges of pavement, melting slowly into gray puddles. Grimaldi lit his cigar, inhaling deeply as smoke curled into the cold evening sky. His bodyguards remained inside, laughing with other guests, trusting the parking lot to remain empty and harmless. They never saw the sedan parked near the far corner. They never saw the 2 figures waiting quietly beside it. Grimaldi heard footsteps behind him, but didn't turn fast enough. A heavy strike slammed into the back of his knee, forcing him to collapse forward before he could reach his weapon. A gloved hand crushed over his mouth, muffling the shout that tried to escape. Another man grabbed his arms, twisting them behind his back with brutal precision. The cigar fell onto the pavement, rolling across melting snow as Grimaldi's body was dragged toward the waiting sedan. The entire abduction lasted less than 10 seconds. Inside the reception hall, music continued playing. Inside the reception hall, guests toasted happiness and new beginnings. Inside the reception hall, Grimaldi's bodyguards laughed, unaware their captain had vanished from existence. Grimaldi woke inside the warehouse already knowing something had gone terribly wrong. Unlike the others, panic didn't hit him first. Rage did. His muscles strained violently against ropes binding him to a chair as he scanned the dim warehouse floor. His breathing slowed when he saw the concrete monuments standing in rows like silent tombstones holding human faces frozen in terror. He recognized them instantly. Frankie Bones, Anthony Bells, Paulie Castellano. Grimaldi's rage cracked into something darker, pure, uncontrollable fear. Boots echoed again. Bumpy Johnson stepped forward, his shadow stretching across the warehouse floor beneath hanging industrial lights. Workers prepared a larger wooden mold positioned in the center of the room, measuring each plank with surgical accuracy. "You thought bodyguards made you untouchable," Bumpy said calmly. Grimaldi snarled behind the gag, eyes burning with hatred. "You thought family gatherings made you invisible. You forgot something important."
Workers dragged Grimaldi toward the empty mold. He fought harder than the others, twisting violently, nearly knocking one man to the floor before another slammed his shoulder against the wooden frame, forcing him upright inside the structure. "No fortress protects a man who believes he's safe," Bumpy said quietly. Concrete mixers roared louder as gray slurry poured into metal buckets. The sound filled the warehouse like thunder rolling across steel walls. Workers lifted the first bucket and tipped it slowly around Grimaldi's shoes. The freezing mixture crawled across his feet, spreading upward with crushing weight. His entire body convulsed with furious resistance as he tried tearing free, veins bulging against his neck while muffled screams erupted behind the gag. Bumpy watched silently, his expression unchanged.
Across New York City, Bonanno captains were already counting missing soldiers. Panic had begun leaking into meetings. Trust had begun cracking inside the organization. And nobody could explain why men were vanishing without witnesses, without bodies, without answers. Inside the warehouse, 4 monuments now stood in silent formation. 12 names remained on Bumpy Johnson's list. And as Grimaldi's furious resistance slowly faded beneath rising concrete, Bonanno himself was about to receive his first terrifying clue that this wasn't random disappearance. This was something far worse, something already standing in plain sight where the entire city would soon be forced to look. New York City had seen violence before. It had seen gang wars, street executions, and bodies pulled from rivers under early morning fog. But nothing had prepared the city for what appeared at sunrise on Atlantic Avenue. The first crowd gathered quietly. Taxi drivers slowed down first, leaning out of windows to stare. Shop owners stepped onto sidewalks, confused by the strange structure planted near the corner of Court Street. Morning commuters slowed their pace, curiosity pulling them closer to something that didn't belong there. From a distance, it looked like abstract construction equipment left behind overnight. A tall gray cylinder stood upright on a steel base, bolted firmly into the sidewalk as if it had grown from the concrete beneath it. But the closer people walked, the quieter they became, because inside the hardened gray column, something human existed. The shape was unmistakable. Arms bent unnaturally inside the stone, a torso trapped beneath solid cement, a face frozen in permanent terror, barely visible beneath layers of hardened gray surface. Snow collected along the edges, melting slowly down the rough texture like tears sliding across lifeless skin. At the base, a polished brass plaque glinted beneath morning sunlight. It read, "Here stands Paulie Castellano. He forgot that some debts cannot be paid with money." The city froze around it. Within minutes, crowds formed thick circles around the monument. Mothers pulled children closer. Workers abandoned bus stops. Vendors forgot their carts. Nobody touched it. Nobody dared step too close. Whispers spread through the crowd, moving faster than radio broadcasts. By noon, sirens echoed across Brooklyn. Officers surrounded the structure, radios crackling with confusion. Detectives studied the monument with expressions that shifted between disbelief and horror. Construction crews were called immediately, hauling jackhammers and cutting equipment toward the site. But the concrete was reinforced with internal steel framing, thicker than any sidewalk foundation they had ever encountered. Breaking it wasn't quick. Breaking it wasn't quiet. Breaking it drew even larger crowds. News photographers arrived before police finished securing the area. Camera flashes exploded as reporters scrambled for angles that captured the disturbing outline trapped in stone. Within hours, newspaper editors across the city scrambled to rewrite front-page headlines. By afternoon, another monument appeared. This one stood outside a Bronx social club known to host Bonanno captains every Thursday night. The second statue looked nearly identical. Another human shape trapped in hardened gray cement, another brass plaque bolted at the base. Crowds gathered there, too. Confusion turned into panic.
By sunset, a third monument appeared in Red Hook near shipping docks controlled by Bonanno affiliates. Then a fourth surfaced near a warehouse entrance in Bensonhurst. Each statue carried the same silent message. Each statue carried another missing soldier's name engraved into brass. The city began whispering one terrifying conclusion. Someone wasn't killing Bonanno soldiers. Someone was displaying them. Joseph Bonanno sat inside his study, staring at a photograph placed carefully on his polished desk. His espresso cup sat untouched beside him, steam fading slowly into the air as his hands trembled slightly beneath the dim chandelier lighting. The photograph showed Paulie Castellano's concrete monument surrounded by crowds and police tape. Clipped to it was a handwritten note delivered inside a plain manila envelope. "Your men are standing where everyone can see them. They will remain there until time erases them. This is the cost of disrespecting Harlem." Bonanno crushed the paper in his fist, rage flashing across his face before fading into something deeper, fear masked behind calculation. His captains gathered around him, their expressions shifting between fury and disbelief as they stared at photographs spreading across the desk like evidence of a nightmare no one understood how to stop. "We hit Harlem," one younger captain demanded. "We burn every club, every street, every building they touch." Bonanno remained silent for several seconds, his mind racing through consequences faster than his men could imagine. "And then what?" he asked quietly. The room fell silent. "If we strike Harlem now, we bring every cop in this city crashing down on us. We start a war in public streets with newspapers watching every move, and we prove that Bumpy Johnson can provoke us into destroying ourselves." No one argued. No one had answers. Because while Bonanno's organization struggled to understand how soldiers were vanishing, Bumpy Johnson had already shifted the battlefield into something far more terrifying than violence. He had turned retaliation into theater. He had turned fear into architecture. He had turned missing men into permanent warnings visible to the entire city. By the third day, 16 concrete monuments stood across Brooklyn and the Bronx, like silent tombstones rising from the sidewalks. The police couldn't remove them fast enough. The newspapers couldn't stop printing them. And the Commission, the ruling council of organized crime families, had just summoned Bonanno to explain why his soldiers were now standing permanently in stone, while Bumpy Johnson prepared to deliver a final message that would decide whether Harlem remained independent or became the center of a war that could burn New York to the ground. The Commission rarely gathered unless something threatened the balance of power across New York City. When 5 crime families shared control of an empire built on fear, money, and silence, stability mattered more than pride. Wars brought police. Wars brought headlines. Wars destroyed businesses that depended on staying invisible.
Joseph Bonanno arrived at the meeting knowing something had already slipped beyond his control. The gathering took place inside a heavily guarded Manhattan townhouse owned by one of the older families. Thick curtains blocked sunlight from reaching the polished wooden conference table where New York's most powerful underworld figures sat waiting. Cigarette smoke floated across the room like fog hanging over a battlefield that hadn't started yet. Bonanno placed a stack of photographs on the table without speaking. Each image showed a concrete monument standing in public view. Each monument displayed one of his missing soldiers. Each plaque carved humiliation into permanent metal. The room stayed silent longer than Bonanno expected. Finally, one of the family heads leaned forward, adjusting his glasses as he studied the images carefully. His expression revealed something worse than anger. It revealed calculation.
"You sent men into Harlem," he said calmly. Bonanno nodded once. "You attempted to collect tribute from an operator who controls his own territory," another boss added quietly. Bonanno folded his hands together, keeping his voice steady. He refused to recognize our authority. The oldest man at the table exhaled smoke slowly, watching it dissolve into the air before speaking. "Harlem isn't commission territory." Bonanno's jaw tightened slightly. "He escalated beyond reason," Bonanno argued. 16 men displayed like trophies. This crosses every line." The room remained silent again, tension stretching across the polished table like a loaded weapon waiting for someone to pull the trigger. Then the Gambino family representative leaned back in his chair, eyes narrowing thoughtfully. "You reached into a neighborhood that wasn't yours," he said. "You tried forcing tribute where agreements never existed. What happened afterward was brutal, but it was retaliation inside his own territory." Bonanno's expression hardened. "You're saying we do nothing?" "I'm saying the commission does nothing," the man replied calmly. The words hit harder than any gunshot. Bonanno stared across the table, searching for support that never came. One by one, the other family leaders nodded in agreement, their faces calm but final. The decision was unanimous. No retaliation. No war support. No protection. The commission wouldn't interfere. Because interfering meant acknowledging Harlem as disputed ground, and none of the families wanted to open that conversation. Harlem generated money, influence, and independence that benefited everyone, as long as no one tried claiming ownership. Bonanno stood slowly, gathering his photographs with measured control. Rage burned behind his eyes, but he understood something deeply dangerous had just happened. He hadn't just lost soldiers, he had lost respect.
And respect was currency, more valuable than money in organized crime. Across Harlem, Bumpy Johnson stood inside the Lenox Social Club, watching evening crowds return to their normal routines. Jazz music filled the air again. Card games resumed. Money flowed across tables like nothing had ever happened. But the neighborhood carried new confidence beneath its surface. People walked taller. Dealers smiled easier. Rumors spread that Harlem had defeated an entire crime family without firing a single public shot. Illinois Gordon leaned beside Bumpy, watching customers laugh and celebrate around them. "The commission backed off," Gordon said quietly, words already spreading. Bumpy sipped bourbon slowly, studying the crowded club floor like a general observing a battlefield after victory. "They didn't back off," Bumpy replied calmly. "They calculated survival." Gordon nodded thoughtfully. "So what happens now?" Bumpy placed his glass down carefully, his reflection shimmering across the dark liquid. "Now Bonanno decides if pride is worth losing everything." Outside, police crews continued dismantling monuments across Brooklyn and the Bronx. Jackhammers roared through hardened cement, while crowds gathered to watch history being erased piece by piece. But even as concrete cracked and steel frames collapsed, the story refused to disappear. Photographs spread through newspapers across the country. Radio stations debated whether it was justice or horror. The city couldn't talk about it. Inside his brownstone study, Bonanno paced slowly beneath chandelier light, replaying the commission's decision over and over in his mind. His captains demanded revenge. His younger soldiers demanded blood. But Bonanno understood something they didn't yet see. Bumpy Johnson hadn't just attacked his organization. He had attacked his legacy. And Bonanno faced a choice no crime boss ever wanted to make: start a war he might not survive, or accept humiliation that could follow his name forever.
As Bonanno stared out his study window into the dark Manhattan skyline, another envelope arrived silently at his front door, carrying a message that would force him to make that decision immediately. A message proving Bumpy Johnson wasn't finished teaching lessons yet. The envelope arrived without a return address, without fingerprints, and without witnesses. It sat quietly on the polished marble table inside Joseph Bonanno's foyer, delivered by hands no security guard remembered seeing. The house remained silent except for the ticking of an antique clock that suddenly sounded louder than usual. Bonanno stared at the envelope for several seconds before touching it. Years of survival in organized crime had trained him to recognize danger hidden inside ordinary objects. Paper could carry more destruction than bullets when delivered at the right moment. He lifted the envelope carefully, weighing it in his hand like it might explode with consequences instead of gunpowder. Inside, a single photograph slid onto his desk. It showed one of the recently dismantled concrete monuments before police removed it. The image captured the human outline still visible beneath hardened cement. Snow clung to the edges like frost wrapping around a gravestone. At the bottom of the photograph, the brass plaque remained clear and impossible to ignore. Bonanno turned the photograph over slowly. A message written in careful, steady handwriting waited on the back. You reached into Harlem once. You lost 16 men. Reach again, and next time the monuments will stand where your family lives. Bonanno's breathing slowed, not from fear, from realization. The threat wasn't emotional, it wasn't impulsive, it was calculated with the same precision that had erased his soldiers one by one. Whoever delivered this message had studied his routines, his family, and his territory as carefully as he had studied Harlem.
His captains entered the study moments later, their voices already filled with rage. "We found the truck routes they used," one of them said. "We got names of suppliers who sold them materials. We can still strike back." Bonanno raised his hand, silencing the room instantly. "You don't understand," he said quietly. The captains exchanged confused looks. "This isn't about materials," Bonanno continued. "This isn't about trucks. This is about psychology. He turned fear into infrastructure. He turned disappearance into public spectacle. And now he's telling us he can place that spectacle anywhere he chooses." Silence filled the study as the weight of those words settled into the room. One younger captain stepped forward anyway, anger burning through his expression. "So we just accept this humiliation?" Bonanno looked directly at him. "You think this is humiliation?" he asked calmly. "Humiliation is temporary. Destruction is permanent." The captain didn't answer. Because deep down, every man in the room had begun hearing the same rumors spreading through New York's underworld. Soldiers whispered about refusing assignments near Harlem. Associates avoided meetings scheduled in uptown neighborhoods. Fear had begun moving through Bonanno's ranks like poison spreading through blood. And fear inside an organization destroyed loyalty faster than gunfire ever could. Bonanno placed the photograph back on his desk, smoothing the edges carefully like he was sealing a chapter of history he could never rewrite. "We step back," he said finally. The words landed heavier than any command he had ever given. "We step back from Harlem permanently. No tribute demands, no territorial claims, no retaliation attempts. That neighborhood belongs to Johnson." The captain stared at him, stunned. "You're surrendering," one of them whispered. Bonanno shook his head slowly. "No," he replied. "I'm preserving what's left of this family."
Across Harlem, Bumpy Johnson stood on a rooftop overlooking Lenox Avenue, watching streetlights flicker on as evening settled across the neighborhood. Below him, crowds moved through clubs, restaurants, and gambling houses with renewed confidence. Business thrived. Fear had shifted direction. Harlem walked differently now, carrying pride beneath every step. Illinois Gordon joined him, lighting a cigarette as wind drifted across the rooftops.
"Word's spreading," Gordon said. "Bonanno backed off completely." Bumpy nodded once, his eyes scanning the glowing streets below. "Good," he said quietly. Gordon exhaled smoke into the cold air. "You think he'll try again someday?" Bumpy watched a police cruiser roll slowly past the Lenox Social Club, its lights reflecting across wet pavement like fading warnings. "No," Bumpy replied, "not him." Gordon studied his expression carefully. "What makes you so sure?" Bumpy turned toward the skyline, Manhattan towers glowing like distant monuments of their own. "Because he understands something most powerful men learn too late," Bumpy said calmly. "Reputation isn't built by winning every fight. It's built by surviving the fights you shouldn't start." Below them, Harlem pulsed with music, laughter, and money flowing through streets that no longer feared outside control. The neighborhood had become something larger than territory. It had become a statement carved into New York's criminal history. But while Bonanno stepped away from Harlem, other crime families across the city had been watching everything unfold in silence. And somewhere in Manhattan, another powerful figure had just begun asking a dangerous question. If Bumpy Johnson could defeat one family without starting a war, what would stop him from challenging the entire underworld next? Victory never arrives quietly in New York City. It travels through whispers, through newspaper ink, through late-night conversations held behind locked doors and dim chandeliers. Within weeks of Bonanno's retreat, Harlem transformed from an overlooked neighborhood into the center of underworld curiosity. Everyone was watching Bumpy Johnson. In Little Italy, the Genovese family held private meetings discussing Harlem's sudden rise in influence. In Queens, Lucchese captains reviewed financial reports showing gambling profits shifting northward. Even the Gambino family, known for calculated patience, began assigning observers to quietly study Johnson's operations. They weren't preparing attacks, they were measuring him. Because power that grows too quickly always attracts attention. Inside the Lenox Social Club, business thrived beyond expectations. Dice rolled across velvet tables, jazz singers performed beneath golden lights, while money moved through counting rooms with machine-like efficiency. Dealers handled stacks of cash that doubled previous month's earnings. Harlem had become safer, richer, and more unified under Johnson's control. Illinois Gordon placed a thick ledger book on Bumpy's office desk, flipping through columns filled with rising numbers. Revenue jumped 30% since Bonanno stepped back. Clubs are packed, bookmakers are expanding, even the numbers runners are bringing in new neighborhoods. Bumpy studied the ledger quietly, his expression thoughtful instead of celebratory.
"Growth attracts envy," he said calmly. Gordon nodded, understanding the warning hidden inside the words. "Other families are watching," Gordon added. "I know," Bumpy replied. He closed the ledger slowly, tapping his finger against the cover as if counting possibilities instead of profits. "We expanded too fast," he continued. "Success makes people careless. Carelessness gets people buried."
Across Manhattan, Carlo Gambino sat inside a private dining room, sipping espresso while reviewing surveillance notes gathered by his trusted associates. Photographs of Harlem nightclubs spread across his table, financial estimates, territory maps, rumors gathered from street-level informants. Gambino studied each detail with calm precision. "He doesn't operate like a street boss," one of his advisors said. "He thinks like a strategist." Gambino nodded slightly. "He turned retaliation into public theater," he replied. "He forced Bonanno to retreat without firing a war that would bring police attention. That shows intelligence." The advisor leaned forward carefully. "You think he'll expand beyond Harlem?" Gambino placed his espresso cup down with controlled patience. "Every successful leader expands eventually," he said quietly. "The question isn't if Johnson grows. The question is how far he believes his reputation protects him." Back in Harlem, Bumpy walked through neighborhood streets without bodyguards, greeting shop owners and club managers who treated him like both protector and ruler. Children waved as he passed. Local business owners nodded with respect earned through stability rather than intimidation. Harlem trusted him, and that trust formed armor stronger than weapons. But armor could become illusion if trusted too completely. As Bumpy stepped into a corner grocery store, an elderly shop owner handed him a folded newspaper quietly. "You should read this," the man said. Bumpy opened the paper, scanning a front-page article discussing Harlem's economic surge. The headline praised Johnson as a figure who brought order to a neighborhood previously fractured by outside interference. The article sounded almost admiring. Bumpy's eyes narrowed. Praise could be more dangerous than threats. Because admiration drew attention, attention drew rivals. Rivals created challenges that forced leaders into decisions capable of destroying everything they built. He folded the newspaper carefully and stepped back onto Lenox Avenue, watching traffic move beneath flickering streetlights. The neighborhood buzzed with confidence, but something beneath the surface felt different now. The city wasn't ignoring Harlem anymore.
The city was studying it. Late that evening, Gordon entered Bumpy's office carrying another envelope delivered through unknown channels. Unlike previous threats, this one carried no hostility. It carried invitation. Bumpy opened it silently. Inside, a single card rested against white paper. "Mr. Johnson, your reputation has impressed many observers. Some would prefer conversation before competition becomes necessary. Meet tomorrow night, Manhattan, private dining room. Come alone." No signature, no organization name, only a location printed neatly at the bottom. Gordon watched Bumpy's expression carefully. "You think it's a trap?" Gordon asked. Bumpy slid the card back into the envelope slowly. "No," he said calmly. "It's something worse." Gordon raised an eyebrow. What could be worse than a trap? Bumpy stood, adjusting his coat as he prepared to leave the office for the night. "An invitation means someone believes they're powerful enough to negotiate with me," he replied quietly. "And men who believe that usually control forces bigger than violence." Outside, Harlem lights shimmered with success and confidence. Inside Manhattan, powerful families were already calculating how to handle a man who had rewritten the rules of retaliation. And as Bumpy prepared to attend the mysterious meeting, he understood one dangerous truth clearly. Beating Bonanno had earned Harlem respect. But respect inside New York's criminal empire often came with invitations that no man could safely refuse. Invitations that sometimes led directly into alliances or directly into graves. Manhattan glittered differently at night. Harlem pulsed with music, laughter, and street-level energy. But Manhattan radiated quiet authority, hidden behind polished glass towers and marble-lined restaurants where power negotiated over candlelight instead of gunfire. The private dining club chosen for the meeting sat behind an unmarked steel door, guarded by two men who didn't speak when Bumpy Johnson arrived. They simply nodded and opened the door. Inside, the lighting was soft and golden, reflecting across crystal glasses and white linen tablecloths arranged with mathematical perfection. The air smelled faintly of expensive cigars and aged whiskey. Every chair, every plate, every folded napkin communicated one message clearly. This was territory controlled by men who believed control should look effortless. At the center table sat Carlo Gambino. He didn't stand when Bumpy approached. He simply gestured toward the empty chair across from him with calm confidence that suggested he expected obedience without asking for it. Gambino's expression carried quiet intelligence rather than intimidation. His reputation alone filled the room with unspoken warning. "Mr. Johnson," he said smoothly, "I appreciate punctuality." Bumpy removed his coat, placing it over the chair before sitting down. His posture remained relaxed, but his eyes studied every reflection inside the polished glassware surrounding them. He counted exits automatically. He measured distances between tables. He registered the two men standing near the doorway pretending to be staff members. "Invitations usually include names," Bumpy replied calmly. "Names create expectations. Expectations create pressure. I prefer conversations without pressure."
A waiter appeared silently, pouring bourbon for Bumpy and espresso for Gambino, before disappearing like a shadow trained never to interrupt important discussions. For several seconds, neither man spoke. They studied each other like chess players evaluating opening moves before touching the board. "You changed New York's balance without declaring war," Gambino said finally. "That's impressive." Bumpy lifted his glass slowly. "I protected my neighborhood," he answered, "nothing more." Gambino leaned back slightly, folding his hands across the table. "Protection that forces one family to retreat becomes influence whether you intend it or not," he replied. "Influence attracts attention. Attention attracts opportunity." Bumpy sipped his drink, waiting for the hidden meaning to surface. "I'm not interested in expanding territory," Bumpy said calmly. "Harlem provides everything my people need." Gambino nodded thoughtfully. "That might be true today," he said, "but cities evolve, businesses expand, opportunities appear where strong leadership already exists. I'm offering stability before other families decide to test your reputation." The words hung between them like smoke curling through candlelight. "You're offering alliance," Bumpy said quietly. "I'm offering recognition," Gambino corrected. "You operate independently. You continue controlling Harlem. In return, our family ensures no other organization interferes with your territory. Business remains peaceful. Profits remain uninterrupted." Bumpy watched him carefully, recognizing the elegance behind the proposal. Gambino wasn't demanding tribute. He wasn't requesting partnership. He was offering protection disguised as respect. "And what do you gain?" Bumpy asked. Gambino smiled slightly. "Predictability," he replied. "I prefer neighbors who understand strategy instead of emotion." Silence settled again as both men considered consequences far larger than simple agreements. Accepting the offer could guarantee Harlem's safety for years. Rejecting it could invite suspicion from families already watching Johnson's rise with cautious curiosity. Powerful alliances created security. Powerful alliances also created obligations. Bumpy placed his glass down gently, staring across the table with steady confidence. "I built Harlem's independence because no outside family controlled its future," he said. Any agreement I make must protect that principle completely." Gambino nodded, seemingly expecting the answer. "That's why this conversation remains private. No contracts, no public acknowledgement, only mutual understanding between men who respect stability." The waiter returned briefly, replacing empty glasses without speaking. Outside the club windows, Manhattan traffic shimmered beneath streetlights like rivers of moving diamonds. The city continued its endless motion, unaware two men were quietly negotiating power capable of shaping New York's criminal future. Finally, Bumpy stood, sliding his coat back over his shoulders. "I'll consider your offer," he said. Gambino remained seated, watching him carefully. "Take your time," he replied. "Just remember something important, Mr. Johnson." Bumpy paused near the exit, glancing back once.
"Reputation opens doors," Gambino continued calmly. "But alliances decide whether those doors lead to opportunity or confrontation." Bumpy nodded once before stepping into the Manhattan night, the steel door closing quietly behind him. Outside, cold air rushed against his face as he lit a cigarette, watching skyscraper lights reflect across wet pavement. Harlem waited for him uptown, glowing with confidence and loyalty. But now another path existed, one that could transform his influence into permanent power, or drag him into political battles far more dangerous than street wars. And as Bumpy drove back toward Harlem, he didn't notice the black sedan quietly pulling into traffic several blocks behind him. A vehicle carrying men who had no interest in alliances, men already planning to prove that New York's underworld still belonged to families who believed Harlem's independence had grown far too bold. The streets between Manhattan and Harlem shimmered beneath wet pavement, reflecting city lights like fractured mirrors. Traffic moved steadily through the late-night rhythm of New York, horns blending with distant sirens and the low hum of engines crawling through crowded avenues. Bumpy Johnson drove calmly, one hand resting on the steering wheel, while the other balanced a cigarette between steady fingers. His mind wasn't focused on the road. It was focused on Carlo Gambino's offer. Alliances meant security. Alliances meant protection from families who preferred force over diplomacy. But alliances also meant invisible chains that slowly tightened around independence. Bumpy had built Harlem into something self-controlled, something proud, something untouched by outside rulers. Accepting protection, even silent protection, risked changing that foundation. He exhaled smoke slowly, watching it drift across the windshield before fading into the night air leaking through a cracked window. Then he noticed headlights. 2 cars behind him, black sedan, same lane changes, same traffic rhythm, too consistent, too patient. Bumpy adjusted his mirror slightly, pretending to check traffic while studying the reflection. The sedan didn't accelerate. It didn't fall back. It maintained distance with professional precision. His pulse didn't change, but his instincts sharpened instantly. Street experience had taught him that obvious tailing meant amateurs, quiet tailing meant professionals, and professionals rarely followed without preparation for violence. Bumpy turned unexpectedly onto a side street leading toward the Harlem River Drive. The sedan followed, maintaining its calculated distance. Confirmation settled into his chest like cold steel. He flicked his cigarette out the window and tightened his grip on the steering wheel. The road along the river stretched darker and quieter than city avenues, streetlights spaced farther apart as traffic thinned into scattered vehicles rushing toward uptown exits. Wind rolled across the water,
carrying icy mist that blurred reflections across the asphalt. Bumpy accelerated slightly. The sedan responded immediately. He slowed near a traffic signal. The sedan slowed. No doubt remained. He was being hunted. Bumpy turned sharply into a narrow industrial street lined with closed warehouses and dark loading docks. Tires screeched briefly against wet pavement as he maneuvered between parked trucks and shadowed alley entrances. The sedan followed aggressively now, abandoning subtlety for speed. Headlights flooded his rear window as the vehicle closed distance rapidly. Bumpy reached beneath his seat, gripping the cold metal handle of a revolver he rarely needed but never traveled without. He didn't draw it yet. He simply held it, feeling its weight anchor his focus.
The sedan swerved suddenly, pulling alongside him with dangerous precision. The passenger window lowered halfway, revealing a silhouette raising something long and unmistakable. Gunfire exploded through the quiet street. Glass shattered across Bumpy's rear windshield as bullets tore through metal and upholstery. He jerked the wheel hard, slamming the accelerator while ducking instinctively below the window frame. His car fishtailed across wet pavement before stabilizing as he shot forward through the industrial corridor. Another burst of gunfire echoed behind him, rounds slamming into the trunk and tearing through the back seat. Bumpy veered toward a loading dock ramp, swerving sharply into a narrow exit alley barely wide enough for his vehicle. The sedan overshot the turn, brakes screeching violently as it attempted to correct its trajectory. Bumpy sped through the alley, emerging onto a crowded cross street filled with late-night taxis and delivery trucks. Traffic forced him to blend into moving vehicles, headlights surrounding him like chaotic camouflage. The sedan burst out seconds later, but city congestion blocked its path. Horns blared as drivers shouted and swerved, trapping the pursuing car behind a stalled delivery truck, struggling to reverse into a loading bay. Bumpy didn't look back again. He drove straight toward Harlem, adrenaline fading slowly into controlled breathing as he navigated familiar streets lined with glowing club signs and late-night crowds. The neighborhood welcomed him with music spilling from open doorways and laughter echoing across sidewalks alive with energy. But tonight, Harlem felt different. Not safer, not calmer, more exposed. Inside the Lenox Social Club, Illinois Gordon rushed toward Bumpy the moment he entered, eyes widening at the shattered glass still clinging to his coat. "What happened?" Gordon demanded. "Someone disagrees with negotiations," Bumpy replied calmly. Gordon's expression hardened instantly. "You think it was Gambino?" Bumpy shook his head slowly, removing his coat and brushing glass fragments onto the floor. "No," he said. "If Gambino wanted me dead, I wouldn't have left that dining room alive." Gordon folded his arms, thinking quickly. "Then who?" Bumpy walked toward his office window, staring down on Lenox Avenue, where crowds continued celebrating Harlem's success, completely unaware violence had nearly followed him home.
"Someone who believes Harlem is growing too powerful," he answered quietly. "Someone who thinks independence threatens the balance of every family watching this city." Gordon stepped beside him, scanning the busy street below. "What do we do now?" Bumpy's reflection stared back at him through the glass, calm but sharpened by realization. "Now," he said slowly, "we prepare for enemies who don't send invitations first." Outside, jazz music floated through Harlem's glowing nightlife, but somewhere in New York's underworld, powerful figures were already debating whether Bumpy Johnson had become a leader worth respecting or a problem that needed to be erased before his influence spread beyond Harlem's streets forever. Harlem didn't sleep that night. Word traveled fast through neighborhoods built on loyalty and survival. Broken glass found in Bumpy Johnson's car, bullet holes tearing through steel, witnesses claiming to hear gunfire echoing across industrial blocks near the river.
By midnight, rumors had already transformed into warnings whispered inside clubs, barbershops, and gambling rooms. The streets still carried music, but underneath every trumpet note and piano rhythm, tension vibrated like a string pulled too tight. Inside the Lenox Social Club, Bumpy Johnson stood at the center of a private meeting, surrounded by his most trusted operators. Illinois Gordon leaned against the wall, arms crossed tightly, as voices filled the smoke-heavy room with urgency. "They crossed a line," one numbers runner argued. "They followed you into our territory. They fired first. That means war rules apply now." The room buzzed with agreement. Men who had built Harlem's underground economy stood ready to defend it with violence if necessary. Loyalty burned through their words, fueled by fear that losing Bumpy meant losing the stability he had created. Bumpy raised his hand slowly. The room fell silent instantly. He walked toward the large window overlooking Lenox Avenue. Streetlights shimmered across crowds moving between nightclubs, restaurants, and late-night shops. Harlem glowed with confidence, with independence, with life that had flourished under his protection. "They want us angry," Bumpy said quietly. No one interrupted. "They want us reckless," he continued, "because reckless men make mistakes, and mistakes give enemies permission to destroy everything we built." Illinois Gordon stepped forward slightly. "They tried to kill you. That's not politics. That's war." Bumpy nodded once. "Yes, and war doesn't always begin with bullets. Sometimes it begins with fear spreading through your own ranks." He turned toward the room, his expression calm but unshakable. "If we respond publicly, every family in New York gains reason to unite against us. Harlem becomes a battlefield, businesses collapse, police flood our streets, and the people who trust us lose everything." The men exchanged uneasy glances, understanding the brutal truth behind his words. "So we do nothing?" one soldier asked. Bumpy stepped closer, his voice lowering but growing stronger. "No," he said, "we do something smarter." Over the next 48 hours, Harlem shifted into silent preparation. Extra security appeared outside clubs without drawing attention. Trusted drivers rotated transportation routes unpredictably. Informants spread across boroughs, collecting whispers from dock workers, bookmakers, and street-level dealers who overheard conversations not meant for public ears. The city didn't notice the transformation, but the underworld did.
By the third night, Bumpy sat inside his office reviewing reports when Gordon entered, holding a folded note taken from a low-level associate arrested during a gambling raid in Queens. The note contained 3 names connected to a Lucchese-affiliated crew quietly expanding into neighborhoods bordering Harlem. "They funded the hit," Gordon said. Bumpy studied the names carefully, recognizing them as ambitious operators desperate to earn status by eliminating a rising power threatening their family's influence. "They moved without commission approval," Gordon added. "That makes them vulnerable." Bumpy folded the note slowly, placing it inside his desk drawer. "Send a message," he said. Gordon raised an eyebrow. "What kind of message?" Bumpy stood, adjusting his suit jacket as he walked toward the office door. "One they'll understand," he replied calmly. 3 nights later, police discovered an abandoned warehouse near the East River. Inside, investigators found 3 luxury cars parked neatly in a row. Each vehicle belonged to one of the Lucchese affiliates connected to the attempted assassination. Each car had its engine running, headlights glowing through warehouse darkness. But inside the driver's seats, no one remained alive. No public displays, no monuments, no messages carved into stone. Just 3 silent reminders delivered privately to the family responsible. The underworld understood the warning instantly. Harlem wasn't expanding. Harlem wasn't declaring war. Harlem was simply proving that survival belonged to leaders who knew exactly when to show strength and when to show restraint.
Weeks later, life across Lenox Avenue returned fully to celebration. Jazz music echoed through clubs packed with customers, businesses thrived, families walked safely beneath glowing streetlights. Harlem had chosen its future, independent, respected, and feared without needing to conquer territory beyond its borders. From his office window, Bumpy Johnson watched the neighborhood breathe with energy he had fought to protect. He understood that power wasn't about controlling every street in New York. Power meant controlling the one place that trusted him completely. But legends never truly end in cities like New York. Stories grow, stories spread, stories inspire new enemies, new challenges, and new battles waiting quietly beyond the skyline. And if you want to hear more dark, powerful stories about crime legends, hidden history, and the shadows that shaped America, make sure you subscribe to Canon of Darkness, because the next story might reveal secrets even more dangerous than the ones Harlem survived.